Evening, everyone. First of all, let me express my pleasure to be here this evening and to have received this wonderful invitation. I did prepare something written, so I'll write it now. So I want to share a little bit of it with you. But let me begin by saying this. My remarks this evening were not authored by me alone. I want to make sure that you understand that there are several people in this room who bear co-authorship to the comments that I'll be making this evening. And I've already warned them that any falsehoods and inaccuracies or blatantly scandalous things I'll say this evening, they share full responsibility for that. And although in the initial outreach that went out, it described my role as a labor relations officer, excuse me, with the Amalgamated Workers Union, most of my comments are going to really be about this community that I've been intimately involved with over the past year or so, and that is with the workers in our nation's landfills. I'm going to describe a little bit about, first of all, why they wouldn't allow me to use that word, so I'm going to have to explain that and define that properly. And I'm going to really posit that the issue of the separation that I recognize between a full recognition of labor rights as human rights is something that is widespread. It is international, not just national, but we bear quite a bit of responsibility and for that in this country for reasons that have to do with the traditional labor movement as well as the public's expectations of who fights for and who defends labor rights. And in the end, what I hope to do is really challenge us to not just think about labor rights in a different way, but also act in a way that represents perhaps a new vision for activist communities as just communities as well, not just the workers I'm speaking about, but activist communities as well, and hopefully forge a new relationship with not just the labor movement, but in particular small unions, such as the one that I represent. Let me take a few seconds to describe what you're seeing in front of you. Now, some of you all may have been hearing some of the ads that have been quite ubiquitous on radio, as well as social media. SwimCall's Get Into Green campaign with SwimCall. As you see here, it says, "We are turning waste into gold." And what you might see behind you, first of all, note there's one human being looking quite well dressed in the midst of this shiny, brand new equipment that is supposed to represent part of our shared national recycling vision. Her daughter Colleen, Marilyn, and Mama are some of the women who work in and support the women who work in our nation's dumps, not landfills, as the workers are quick to point out that these areas are not engineered to meet the international standards associated with proper landfills. Recently, speaking to a female activist for women's rights at the recent event at UWI, when I spoke about the work I did, she said, "I honestly didn't know there were women working in the landfills." Now, they work as recorders at the entrances to our dumps, hand sorters of plastic waste in barely covered or uncovered surroundings, without the conveyor belts that we see on TV that normally allow the typical factory worker to separate the barely sorted plastic from the other waste coming from our homes and collection containers. The landscape includes idyllic-sounding fecal ponds of raw sewage, 3 large dirt receptacles originally intended to serve SwimCall's limited needs, but now receive all the collected waste of the population of Trinidad. They are long past capacity and overflown whatever embankments they have ever had, now indistinguishable from the surrounding earth, bone dry in the form of particulate fog, and separate from dark, wet patches after a recent spill. The fecal-filled, hazardous, and toxic dust of our dumps is overwhelming and ever-present, casting an early morning haze or evening hue over garbage mountains, cityscapes of mangled and corroded iron waste, kobo dotting every slope and land patch. Newly installed board members of the Solid Waste Management Company, or SwimCall, on a recent first tour of the Beetham site, would not step outside their air-conditioned maxis without masks. Many would not alight from their vehicles at all. Our dumps are sprawling, self-contained dystopias within our state, with their own indigenous and migrant labor forces and wandering populations. Now, these landscapes, so far from our imaginations, perhaps glimpsed in our peripheral visions as we drive by on our highways, are never reflected in public representations of the promise of recycling, of renewal, or even of environmental justice. SUMCOL's recent campaign, radio and visual ads, includes images of managers among shiny modern equipment used to pulverize plastic into pellets. The 200 workers on whose labor these glistening, clean utopias depend on are totally absent, invisible. A clean, green, recycled future filled with promise without workers. Disposable people, disposable lands. The men and women who work on our dumps are the sorters, attendants, recorders, whacker-men and tip-men, technicians, mechanics, welders, who are basically the last custodians of our nation's health. Most of them earn about $220 a day, about $4,400 a month, what they should have earned over a decade ago, and what they have earned since 2013. Now, these are the final handlers, dumpers, and sorters of the waste of our population of 1.3 million people. These sanitation workers providing an essential and hazardous service that guarantees our health. They have paid and continue to pay for this with their very bodies every day. They are the 0.01% among us on whom we all rely. Now, this population of vulnerable workers, I start with them because I want to basically ground our comments and our consideration of the extent to which labor rights, especially the right to a fair and just remuneration, are fully integrated into discourses of human rights here in Trinidad and Tobago and globally. Now, we know that Article 23 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights includes the right to work, to free choice of employment, just and favorable conditions of work, and so on. And at Section 3, it states, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for herself and her family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. Now, this is also, of course, included in Part 3 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which I'm sure you're fully familiar with. Now, TNT has ratified all fundamental 8 ILO conventions, including those that provide rights to association, to join unions, ILO conventions against forced labor, and so on. Yet a 2016 UN report by UN Special Rapporteur Maina Kayai criticized the artificial distinction between labor and human rights, noting the progressive weakening of labor rights in the face of the growing concentration of corporate power. So despite states' responsibilities under international law to respect and promote workers' rights, this report argued the strength of multinational corporations means that in reality, these states are often failing, including our own. So to wrap up, what I want to suggest is this. As a labor relations officer, what concerns me is that every day workers are coming in, and they are not the ones that we are representing in our unions. These are workers unrepresented, coming for the first time and wondering why they have been summarily dismissed without notice, without reason given, even though they are manager, supervisor, technicians, computer techs, you name it. Now, the fact is, therefore, what we're suggesting here is that despite the fact that we have a bag of rights and a fundamental legal framework for labor rights in this country, we do not yet really have the realization of those rights, and particularly those rights that basically guarantee a living wage. So we have to change our discourse, and we have to change that discourse to include living wage campaigns, which have been successful in other countries, certainly the United States and others. Communities like our landfill workers deserve a livable wage more than a minimum wage. They deserve the right, as we have discussed this evening, of conceiving of dignified lives. And so what we are doing, I'm going to jump to the end and say, hopefully in collaboration with Mindwise and others, we are intending to launch a campaign that breaks from the traditional labor's emphasis on get out the street campaigning, to organize and collaborate with just communities such as yourselves to ensure that workers like these do not fall into the stasis of our national approach to wages, where the stasis itself becomes the shock doctrine, as Naomi Klein mentions it. And this is what our campaign, you are the first to see this. We are teasing what we hope is our first new approach to a kind of online and activist organizing. And in my last few seconds, let me introduce members of of the workers I'm speaking of, our members of the Industrial General and Sanitation Workers Union, members of the sanitation, the workers at Swim Call, who I would like to thank for the comments this evening and acknowledge their presence here in the room this evening. If you could just stand for 1 second. All right. Jason, President, Robert Benassia, and many of the women that we never see who are working at our landfill institutions. Thank you very much.